Hey there, I'm Yankel, and today I'm gonna show you the fastest, easiest, and most delicious way to cook ground beef from frozen. We're gonna start with 1 pound of rock solid ground beef. The first thing we're gonna do is get it under some cool running water just to loosen up the packaging so I can take it out. Heading over to the sink. I've got a bowl ready. Just putting it into the bowl and running some cool water. All you need is about a minute under the cool running water for the surface of the meat to defrost enough so that plastic comes loose. Now we can get it out of the package with no problem at all. We're gonna head over to our workstation and get started on cooking it. A couple key points to remember when cooking ground beef. One is we want browning. Browning is where all the flavor happens. It's known as the Maillard reaction. It's when protein and amino acids mix under heat and they create these incredible flavor compounds. The more browning we get, the better it's gonna taste. And when we do it from a frozen brick like this, we have the opportunity to brown every bit of the meat. Now, we've got a pan. I'm using a cast iron pan, my favorite thing to cook meat in. We're gonna go with medium-high heat. We want the pan to stay hot while we continue to brown the meat. Even though we're gonna turn it over back and forth, the pan has the opportunity to cool down, so we want a good cast iron pan that's gonna keep it hot. Now, when it comes to the oil you're gonna use, ground beef does tend to have a lot of fat in it. In this case, it's an 85-15 percentage. That means 15% fat is mixed in to give it that nice fatty texture, but it's still a little bit lean, and what we don't wanna do is scorch the pan. So I'm gonna add a little bit of high temperature oil to the pan. Now I'm using an avocado oil. It's been refined. You generally want a refined oil because it has less impurity in it. So choose a high temperature oil. Other options are coconut oil or ghee, clarified butter. Any of the safflower, sunflower, corn oils work really well, as long as it's good for a high heat and won't start to burn as it gets really hot. We need high heat for good browning. So we're gonna let our pan heat up for just a minute. And you know your pan is hot when the oil begins to move around on the surface. While we wait for the pan to heat up, let's talk about the 3 key elements to getting any type of ground meat to taste really, really good. Number 1 is salt. So we've got coarse ground salt that I'm gonna grind directly into our ground beef as it's cooking. And then we've got some dried spices. In this case, I'm using an Italian seasoning blend, but really any combination of dried spices that you love would work well. And the last thing is moisture. We want to incorporate a little bit of moisture so the beef doesn't dry out. So what we're gonna use today is some basic canned tomato sauce. Use your favorite sauce. You can use tomato sauce, you can use diced tomatoes, beer, wine, beef stock, chicken stock, any kind of moisturized flavoring that's gonna make it taste really good. Even a splash of water if you don't have anything else around. All right, pan is starting to get hot. So we're gonna go in there with our ground beef. This method was introduced to me by our ButcherBox test kitchen manager, Emily, and I'm calling it the brown and flip. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna cook this brick on one side for about a minute. And then we're gonna flip it over and we're gonna scrape off the cooked part while the other side cooks. And then we're gonna flip it over again and scrape off the cooked part while the other side cooks. And we're gonna repeat that, flip, cook, scrape, until it's all browned and in the pan. Then we'll start adding our spices and our moisture. Emily, how long do you leave it on each side? 2 minutes. All right. We're gonna go with 1 minute and see what happens. But Emily says 2 minutes, and she's usually right. You can see that browning beginning to happen. Of course, Emily was right, so we're gonna give it another minute. If you are not cooking frozen ground beef, if your ground beef has already been defrosted, one of the things that happens is you brown the first part of it, and then the pan cools down, and the beef gives off moisture, and all of a sudden, is just turning gray as you continue to cook it. So the way around that is to cook it in batches. Separate the ground beef into 4 equal parts and then cook one part at a time. Take it out of the pan, cook the next part. Then you get beautiful browning on each part of the ground beef. Those will continue to brown while we let the other side cook. And we're just going to repeat this process probably 5 or 6 times until it's all nicely browned and cooked. We want the ground beef cooked about 90%, so almost no pink at all before we start to add other ingredients. You really want to cook ground beef all the way through. Once you get down to the bottom, you can just break it up with your tongs. We're gonna let the rest of that brown up. Getting a nicely browned ground beef is gonna make it taste like the best steak, maybe even better. It's often the same cuts that are steak, except we're getting that browning process all over every little bit. When you bite into a steak, that browning process is just on the outside. You can make ground beef taste even better using this method. We're gonna stir all that up. Look at that beautiful browning all over. You get those crunchy, crispy little bits of brown meat that make it taste so darn good. Once the last of the pink starts to disappear, we're gonna add some spices. I like to add the spices, especially dried spices, before I add any moisture. Give them a chance to bloom, to really have that dried flavor come alive. So we're gonna go with a little bit of salt first. There will be an exact amount in the recipe, but I highly recommend that you experiment and just sprinkle or grind a little bit at a time and then taste it, because you're gonna realize you don't need to measure every single time you cook. A healthy pinch of our Italian seasoning. We're gonna give that a quick stir. And when you're done with this dish, if you were gonna add vegetables or some other element to it, right now would be the time, especially if you were adding onions or squash or something like that. You'd want it to brown a little bit before we add moisture. Once we add moisture, the browning process is done. So we're gonna add our tomato sauce. Of course, like I said, limitless possibilities. Use your favorite sauce, use your favorite liquid, even a splash of water. If you wanted to turn this into a soup, you could use tomato juice and other vegetables and add a whole lot more liquid. If you want it to be like a filling for a taco or a sloppy joe on a lettuce wrap, just cook the liquid down a little bit so it's a little bit drier. So many possibilities. Fresh herbs at the end would make it absolutely incredible. Just tear some fresh basil in there. You can serve this over rice, over noodles, zoodles, whatever makes you happy. We're pretty much done. All we have to do is check our final seasoning, make sure it tastes exactly the way we want it to. I know I seasoned it enough for the ground beef that was in there, but I added moisture, so I'm gonna add a little bit more salt just to match the volume of what's in the pan. Let's give that a quick taste. That is so good, so good. The beefiness comes through so beautifully when you brown it that way. No more gray ground beef, no need to defrost it. Brown and flip, that's the way to do it. Take a look at that. I'm Yankel, go cook something frozen.